Hi everyone, I'm Maggie, and for my final presentation, I've chosen to expand on my preservation leaflet assignment to discuss an interesting debate I saw throughout the literature about whether libraries and archives should include zines in their collections. I wanted to dive into what's at the root of this debate a little bit more and possibly propose an approach that might offer a way forward. First, what is a zine? How can we define it? I think that it is pretty difficult to really pinpoint how we can best define zines. I'm going to share a few ways that we can come at trying to define them throughout this presentation, but it's important to note that this is sort of what makes it challenging for libraries and archives, is that they seem unclassifiable. But in general, we can keep in mind that zine, it takes its name from the end of the word magazine. But even though we can think of these as sort of miniature magazines, I think that still begs the question of, what is a miniature magazine and what are the characteristics of it? One way we can come at defining what a zine is to think about the purpose that the zine has had throughout its history. So beginning in the 1930s and the 1950s, which is typically around the time when the first zines were thought to be created, they were really a space for sci-fi fans to create fan fiction. In the 1970s, the punk movement took them up and used them to critique capitalism, to really report on the punk music scene. The feminist movement toward the late 80s and going into the 90s used zines because they were really, really easy to create and circulate. And then a really interesting trend is how Gen Z has really elevated the zine to another level. They tend to be more polished, they're shared or actually born on the internet. And these zines are kind of occupy a more mainstream space than their predecessors. I do want to call out that zines have never actually gone away at any point. I just wanted to use this timeline to show when their creation and distribution has been most active. The thing that does cut across this timeline is how zines have been used by groups that are typically marginalized in order to sort of express their point of views and critique the quote unquote mainstream. Another way we could try and define zines is to look at the features that are typically used to describe them. The first one being DIY or do it yourself, which is really an attitude and an approach to how and why they're created. Ephemeral, so zines are meant to capture a moment and be spontaneous and spur of the moment and sort of just really capturing an instant. Unfiltered, so this means that any language, any idea, anything can be used to make up a zine. Alternative, so as the timeline suggested, they are countercultural, against the mainstream, in tension with the mainstream and conflict with the mainstream. Undefinable, the thing that makes them really, really difficult for libraries and archives to work with. They don't have a definition, they're really hard to classify. And reproducible, so at their core, zines should be easy to reproduce, whether that is the creator being able to create a bunch or just the audience for these zines being able to take them and copy them and reproduce them. Ultimately, though, the number one feature is that there is no editor. There's no authority. There's no one determining what can and cannot be included. I want to specifically call out this zine from the 1970s UK called Sniffin' Glue. This is the cover from a 1977 issue. But this was the first zine to chronicle the punk scene from in the inside. And while it did actually have an editor, which is sort of why I want to call it out. The editor's name was Mark Perry. The editing style was really unpolished. It used a lot of informal writing and swear words, and it was completely unfiltered. Another way we could try and define the zines, how I've seen zines trying to be defined, is to think about its materials and how they're made. So how they're folded, which is what this image on the left from Jillian Tamaki shows, a diagram for how you can fold them, and just in general what the typical materials of a print zine would be, from paper to staples to glue. Anything at your disposal, anything could be a zine. And so, what does that mean? When thinking about how to best define this format. To define them, we can also consider what zines are today, what they've evolved into. Not only are zines available in mainstream stores, so zines today, meaning, sorry, the zines that are created by millennials or Gen Z, the zines of today, modern zines, not only are zines available in boutique and mainstream stores and even in some libraries. I think about 24 libraries across the US have them in circulation now. Many are also digital first, or at least have some digital element, whether that's they're sold online, have a website, shared on Instagram, what have you, which is, I think, a really interesting piece of what the modern zine is. You'll also see that zines are a lot more polished, and they tend to function more like literary magazines. They have editors, they put out calls for submissions. Some can also be pretty pricey. You can see here this example on the right. The prices for an issue can range anywhere from $15 to $40. And so what millennials and Gen Z have created is perhaps, and I put the quote along the top here, it's from Vanessa Wallows in a piece that she wrote for a publication called The Millennial Source, that there's something that looks like zine culture. Something that looks like zine culture. And I think the question that this really sparks for me here is not so much to think about what a zine is, but, why a zine over, in the digital age, a blog or a newsletter? So the question is really, what is it about this format? Not so much what is this format and what defines this format. I also wonder if this modernization of the zine actually makes them a little bit easier to classify, or maybe it's complicated things. If we look at the quote over here on the right from Professor Stephen Duncombe, the professor is pointing out in this quote that, when zines were not as accessible as they are today, we at least knew that they belonged to the counterculture. But now they really do belong to whoever wants to make them, which is pretty fitting with how our culture has been shaped by the internet and blogs and social media. Anyone who wants to create something and be the owner of something can. And so it's interesting to think how, the digital age has really started to shape the modern zine. Okay, so what people call a zine has always been pretty subjective. I read one source that considers Martin Luther's 95 Theses to be a type of zine. Benjamin Franklin's basically printing press in Philadelphia makes him the original zinester, or so one source called him. And another source, has actually said that American Revolutionary broadsides could be considered political zines. And this is all because zines tend to be self-published and very spur of the moment, very much a reaction to some sort of cultural moment. They're starting a conversation. So this leads me to think that to define zines, we actually really need to look to their ethos or philosophy, which the first citation I have up here from Matthew Firth would actually laugh at, because he thinks that it's ridiculous to think that zines have a philosophy or an ethos, since philosophy is all about reason, and zines are meant to be very, very much based on instinct. But for lack of a better way to describe this, I'm going to call it an ethos. So the ethos of zines, I've used these 3 quotes that I've pulled from sources that I've read to kind of get across what this ethos is. The idea that zines are based on instinct, the idea that zines can be a direct link to an individual's opinion, they're basically their personal interpretation of the world. And my favorite one from Baker and Cantillon, that zines are not about the product, but about the process as well. So the process of making them is really, really important. This got me thinking about whether the ethos of a cultural object should dictate how it's actually preserved. So if we look at the image on the left here from archival consultant Margot Note, she took on the project of archiving her husband's personal zine collection that he had stored under his bed. We can see that these zines are kind of haphazardly thrown into a plastic container. This plastic container doesn't have a lid, and they've basically just been shoved under a bed for 20 plus years. I know that keeping zines in a plastic bin under a bed goes against preservation standards, but it does somehow sort of fit the ethos of this format a little bit. And I wonder if when preserving an artifact, the ethos of its creation sort of needs to be taken into account a little bit, especially with something like the zine that is so alternative and countercultural. Continuing on with Margot's work, I want to talk a little bit about her approach to preserving her husband's zines and archiving them, and how she took the ethos into account in her approach. So she opted for minimal viable processing. Due to the nature of zines, she wasn't able to capture information like title and issue number and month and year and even the author's name. So she sometimes just had to choose to skip information that was unavailable. She also didn't catalog the zines, especially online, to the extent that she might for other materials or other projects. This was a personal collection after all, but also, these zines were all created before the age of the internet, and she believes that creators have a right to be forgotten. So Margot's main goal for this project did end up being to stop further damage to the decaying materials. Challenges that zines pose to libraries and archives. So some of the challenges that Margot faced for her personal collection are actually what keep many libraries and archives from wanting to preserve them. Some of them being the cheap quality of materials that can be difficult to stabilize, to the fact that materials are not consistent across the format, from issue to issue, zine to zine. Details like the author and issue number are not always easy to find, so it's difficult to catalog and maybe get permission. And then potential copyright issues. So this is really depending on the source materials that a creator uses to make their zine. Say a creator has used images or text, or just even full paragraphs and whatnot taken from another copyrighted source. If the library were to choose to digitize these could raise some potential copyright issues. All of these issues, I think, have to make me think about this other question about the zine format and whether the zine even, resists preservation, especially if we think about some of the features that we talked about on an earlier slide, where they're undefinable, they are alternative, they are also ephemeral, they're spur of the moment. And I think that it should be an archivist's job to think about how this format might be resisting preservation and whether or not it should move forward. One of the biggest debates around the preservation of zines is whether they should be digitized, because this would make them much more accessible. And this does align with preservation best practices, but not always with the ethos of zines. So I think that there are some pros and cons that have to be heavily weighed when we think about and start to talk about whether or not we should digitize zines in a collection. The three main pros that I've outlined here are that obviously digitization would help ensure long-term access and enjoyment of these zines that are made from rapidly degrading materials. It would also introduce these as primary sources of movements and issues in the past to new generations, like Gen Z and millennials, who want to take them as inspiration for maybe taking the form to a new level. Digitization would also reignite interest in the zine format for self-expression. It would also reignite interest in a lot of libraries have started to include zines in their circulating collections just to bring in new demographics, younger demographics, because zines have sort of become a trendy thing nowadays. And then some of the main cons, so might run into issues with tracking down unknown creators of acquired zines, so zines that have been acquired by an archive or a library. They have been created in the moment, and so maybe they're not really intended for long-term preservation, and maybe it's not actually something that the creator would have wanted. And of course, copyright issues could be a big deal. Not really knowing what the permissions are for items or materials included in a zine. And this could also be a violation of a person's right to be forgotten. Okay, so a way forward. This is the approach, the 5-point approach that I've sort of come up with for dealing with DIY ephemera, particularly zines. So number one is that the physical format of the zine should always be preserved, and this focus should be on stopping future damage. And the way to do this is to think about just how you would basically preserve other paper materials. Like most of them, zines can be stored in low light conditions and at room temperature or lower. The physical structure of the zine, if it doesn't seem necessary for understanding the content, I think it is best to remove fasteners like staples and paper clips. Any zines that are accompanied by stickers and postcards and pins and other ephemera, they should be physically stored together if this is at all possible, but sometimes these items have their own preservation requirements. So they should be stored, they should then be stored separately, but the use of a finding aid should be used to basically make that intellectual connection between them. Number two, getting back to finding aids. So finding aids should be used to detail how a collection is organized. So at the folder level, keep it to a minimal description, but the finding aid, really use that for your full description. And this is where two main things here. You can use the finding aid to, of course, explain the intellectual relationship between items in and across boxes or folders. And then number two, especially if you are going to digitize, this is where it needs to be made clear that a collection contains a print original and a digital copy. Number three, only digitize when you have clear permission. This could be different from archivist to archivist, institution to institution. But the thinking here is that number one, you should have permission from the creator or the creator's family. This is definitely absolutely a requirement. If there's no permission there, should not digitize. Zines that borrow content from other sources should be examined according to fair use under the Copyright Act of 1976. So this fair use actually does allow for the use of copyrighted work for the intended purpose of comment, criticism, teaching, and news reporting, which is really arguably what most zines do. So as long as there isn't an overwhelming amount, but of course, the institution's discretion needs to really be used here to judge like what would an overwhelming versus minimal amount be. It's not an overwhelming amount. If it's a minimal amount and it's used to really comment and critique and has a purpose within the zine, then it is okay to move forward, I think, with digitization. Number four, make digitized zines findable with metadata. A really, really cool thing is that a lot of libraries that have started to archive and include zines in their collections, they are actively developing a metadata standard called Zine Core. It does map to Dublin Core, and it's really just there to apply some consistency across institutions who have zines, making it even easier for researchers to access them for their whatever they need. And finally, I think collaboration with community activists, whether or not you choose to digitize, whether or not you choose to just preserve a print collection, whether you choose to have both, however you choose to, manage your zine collection, I think collaborating with community activists is important. These marginalized groups whose voices are typically excluded from mainstream productions and are the creators of such zines. I think bringing them into the process of archiving them, digitizing them is just a really great way to respect the ethos that actually led to their creation in the first place. In conclusion, I do believe that there is an approach to preserving and reformatting print zines that respects both the ethos of zine creation and preservation best practices. It involves digitizing the publications for easy access and stabilizing the print originals. Thanks so much for listening to my presentation. I do have a few reference slides that shows the different articles and resources that I've looked at to put this together and develop this argument and framework. So yeah, thanks for listening.